The board asked me to start at the beginning, so I will. 14 years ago, I was a garrison sergeant attached to the Compact's Frontier Resettlement Division, stationed at Forward Post Tethek on the outer Corundal Corridor. Tethek was not a prestigious assignment. It was a way station on the edge of what the cartographers politely called contested resettlement territory, and what everyone who worked there called something considerably less polite. We processed incoming colonist transports, ran perimeter checks, logged complaints about water table contamination and boundary marker disputes, and the general low-grade misery of people who had been promised a new start and received instead a piece of ground that required considerably more of them than they had expected to give. I had been there for 6 years by the time the Sorvakh came. They came on a resettlement transport, the Outer Keth, which had picked them up, or had them deposited on it. The exact legal status was still being argued when I left Tethek 8 years later, at a disbanding frontier outpost called Hesavar Station. Hesavar had been a compact wildlife management post for 11 years. When it was decommissioned due to budget reorganization, 3 juvenile Sorvakh who had been born in the station's eastern holding compound were listed on the manifest as wildlife assets pending relocation. The adult Sorvakh who had denned near the station had moved on 18 months prior. The 3 juveniles had not. They had stayed near the perimeter fence. The station's last manager, a woman named Ota Revith, had been feeding them off the loading dock for the better part of a year, which the Wildlife Division was subsequently informed of, and subsequently chose not to make the centerpiece of any formal review. In the way that organizations with complicated histories often make choices that prioritize institutional continuity over precise documentation. Ota Revith retired to a resettlement colony in the inner corridor and could not take them with her. So they were loaded onto the Outer Keth in 3 separate quarantine capsules, labeled Sorvakh Juvenile, Uncontrolled Status, and sent it to wherever the manifest sent them, which turned out to be Forward Post Tethek. Sorvakh, for the record, are listed in the Compact Wildlife Registry as Class 6 pack predators, restricted transfer. The classification exists because they are large. The adults run 2.5 meters at the shoulder, sometimes considerably more depending on the individual, fast, highly territorial, and possessed of a neurological feature called the ridge spine array that most species who have encountered them in the field describe, in official reports that are attempting professional neutrality, as alarming. The ridge spines are a line of neural-connected bony crests that run from the base of the skull to the mid-back. In a full adult male, the count is 31. In a juvenile, the count is lower, and the spines themselves are shorter, which is the only physical characteristic that makes a juvenile Sorvakh less imposing than an adult, and it is not a characteristic that persists long. In a resting animal, the spines lie flat and flush and glow a very faint amber, warm as a lamp left on in another room. When the animal is alert but not yet threat-locked, they rise to a brighter, harder amber and hold there, attending to whatever has drawn the attention. When the animal is threat-locked, assessment complete, verdict rendered, the matter settled in the animal's terms, they rise fully and turn white, not warm white, the cold, absolute white of a cutting torch held at its peak output. The light they cast throws distinct shadows. I have seen that 3 times in my life. I will describe 2 of those times to the board shortly. The third was at Hesavar Station before my posting there, and it was not directed at a person. I read about it in Ota Revith's handover notes, which the Compact's Wildlife Division had apparently not read. She wrote that the adult Sorvakh pack departed the station on the same day that a second wildlife management company arrived with capture equipment and stated intentions. The ridge spines of the adult pack went white for approximately 30 seconds. Then the adults left the territory entirely, and the capture team departed the station shortly after, and the 3 juvenile Sorvakh who remained were never once threat-locked in the stations, records for the remainder of Hesavar's operational life. Revith's note on the sequence, they stayed because they chose to stay, suggests that distinction be respected going forward. Suggest. As if the Compact was in the habit of taking suggestions from retiring station managers, as if anyone had read the handover notes at all. Forward Post Tethek, for context, was the kind of posting that produced either exceptional soldiers or exceptional paperwork, and in my 6 years there I had become primarily the second kind. The work was important in the way that unglamorous work is always important. Somebody had to do it, and if it was done badly, the consequences fell on people who did not have the resources to absorb them. Colonists arrived with manifests that did not match their cargo. Colonists arrived with medical conditions their intake documents had not disclosed. Colonists arrived expecting a staffed settlement office and found instead a portable structure with a broken ventilation unit and a 2-week wait for their first interview. I managed these things. I was good at managing them. I had no illusions about what the work was or was not, and I was satisfied with it in the way that I find preferable to both contentment and dissatisfaction. When the Outer Keth docked with the 3 quarantine capsules on its manifest, the post commander called me in and told me that Forward Post Tethek had been selected as the transit point because it was the nearest facility with a Hold 7 rated quarantine bay. The rating had been assigned during a previous cycle for reasons that predated my arrival and that nobody on the current staff had ever had occasion to use. The post commander expressed, in the measured tones of a senior officer who had trained himself not to express what he actually felt about things, that he found this situation suboptimal. I told him I would handle the daily protocol checks. He told me to follow the protocol. I said I would. Both of these statements were true at the time I made them. At Forward Post Tethek, the 3 juveniles were assigned to Quarantine Hold 7, which was a concrete bay with a reinforced partition and an airlock-style entry corridor, built for exactly this category of transfer. Standard protocol for Class 6 wildlife, full hazard gear for all personnel entering, 2-person minimum, weapons at the ready, duration of contact not to exceed 15 minutes per session. The post commander issued a standing assignment. Corporal Jend and I would conduct the daily welfare checks. Jend was 22 years old and terrified of them in the clean, honest way of a person who has never pretended otherwise. I was 39 and not terrified, but I want to be accurate about this. On the record, I was not unafraid. I had read the incident reports from Hesevar and 2 other frontier stations. I knew what Sorvakh could do when they decided to do it. I understood that the classification was not bureaucratic excess. The first check took 40 minutes because Jend and I spent 25 of them standing in the airlock entry corridor working up the nerve to open the inner door. When we did, the 3 juveniles were at the far end of the hold, pressed together in a corner. The smell of the hold reached me before I was fully through the door, concrete and the particular dry, sharp, resinous smell I was encountering for the first time, and would come to know very well over the following years. Something between heated stone and cut wood, clean and specific and entirely unlike anything else. 2 of the 3 had their ridge spines flat and dim. The third, the largest, the one I later learned to call Wreck, had his halfway raised, hovering between flat and full alert, not white, a dull amber orange, not threat-locked, something else. Something I did not have a word for at the time and still do not, in any language the compact uses formally for wildlife behavioral assessment. He was frightened. That is what I saw. He was a long way from the only place he had known. In a concrete room with no windows and 2 armored strangers, and he was simply frightened. I don't know how to explain what it felt like to recognize that without editorializing, and the board has asked me not to editorialize, so I will describe what I did. I sat down on the floor, cross-legged, in the middle of the hold, not advancing and not retreating. Nothing in my posture that could be reasonably read as either aggression or submission. I put my hands on my knees. I looked at the floor at a point approximately 1 meter in front of me, not at the animals, because direct frontal eye contact is threat behavior in most species, and I had read enough to know it applied here. Jen, to his considerable credit, said nothing, though I could hear his breathing through his suit filter, and it was not the breathing of a man who was entirely calm. We sat there for 14 minutes. At the end of those 14 minutes, Rex ridge spines had descended all the way back to flat amber. The other 2, Neth and Durrell, though I did not yet know those names, I just thought of them as the smaller one and the one with the scar along her left flank, had separated from the corner and were simply standing, watching. Neth had her head slightly tilted. Durrell was watching the middle distance with an expression I would eventually learn to recognize as her default register for situations she found unresolved. It was a look that suggested she had formed a view and was withholding it pending additional information. The concrete smell of the hold stayed with me after the first check. I noticed it on my suit when I removed it in the decon corridor, and later, when I was writing the report, I kept stopping because my hand was near my face and the smell was still there, faint in the fabric of my undersuit. I had not expected that. I had expected the smell of confined animals in a small space, which I had encountered at other postings in less pleasant forms. What I got was the resinous, clean smell that I now associate entirely with Sorvakh, that I can identify at distance in a way I could not have described to anyone before I knew it. I did not write this in the report. I wrote, Hold 7 welfare check conducted per protocol. 3 juveniles located at far end. No aggressive behavior displayed. Contact duration 14. Animals assessed as stressed. No physical indicators of illness or injury. Recommend daily contact continue. The post commander initialed it. What I did not write was that I had sat on the floor of a quarantine hold with 3 animals that could have ended my career and several of my structural arrangements in under 10 seconds, and they had not. And when I left the hold, I sat in the decon corridor alone for a few minutes before going back to the administrative block. Not because I was shaken, because something had happened that I did not have immediate language for, and I have learned over a long career to give things their moment before I put them away and return to work. A rhythm developed over those months that I have thought about many times since. It is not dramatic. It is the word I keep returning to, a rhythm. A pattern of presence and acknowledgement that is unremarkable from the inside, the way any daily routine is unremarkable from the inside. I came into the hold at the same time every morning. Not because I had been instructed to establish a predictable schedule, because I came at the same time every morning, because routine in my experience of frontier postings is a form of respect. It tells the situations in your care that your presence is reliable, that they can put you in the category of things that happen consistently. By month 8, Rek was at the door when I arrived, not waiting in an anxious sense. Just there, weight settled, ridged spines at warm idle amber. He would rise when I entered, orient in the unhurried way that was by then familiar to both of us, and then settle again nearby. I fed them at the second check of the day. The assigned feeding delivery was irregular, and the irregularity produced elevated alertness. I took over the second check as the feeding check and put it on a consistent schedule. The agitation stopped. I noted this in a report once. The post commander initialed it without comment. We left. I wrote the report. The post commander reviewed it, noted that contact had exceeded the 15-minute protocol limit by 1 minute, and told me to keep it tighter. The next check, I sat down again, and the one after that. By the end of the first month, Rek was sitting within 3 meters of me during checks. Not advancing, just sitting, in the middle of the hold, at that distance, with his ridged spines at the flat, warm amber of rest, the dim pulse of them moving slightly with his breathing. By the end of the second month, he was close enough that I could have reached out and touched the fur along his shoulder if I had chosen to. I did not. That was not my decision to make. He could reach out and touch me if he chose to. I sat and he sat, and we were in the same space, and that was sufficient, I noted in my reports. Animals displaying reduced stress indicators. Contact duration within protocol. No incidents. Jen requested reassignment after the first 6 weeks. He was not a coward. He told me the Sorvakh gave him a feeling he could not adequately describe, and that he would rather describe it from a greater operational distance. I filed the request without comment and took over the checks alone. The post commander noted the protocol violation and issued a written reminder. I filed it. I kept going in. Month 4, Rek touched my hand with his nose. This is a significant gesture among Sorvakh, as I later learned from a behavioral monograph that Ota Revith had filed with the Wildlife Division, and that the Wildlife Division had apparently filed in the category of reading that could be deferred. In Sorvakh pack structure, nose contact initiates scent mapping, the first formal step by which a pack individual incorporates another individual into its territorial recognition index. It is not casual. It is not reflexive. The animal makes a deliberate decision, physiologically measurable in the neural activity of the ridge spine array, to begin the process of mapping a specific being as inside the territory rather than outside it. Revith's note on the consequences. Once a Sorvakh has scent mapped an individual, that individual is, in the pack's terms, permanently pack. There is no mechanism in their behavioral architecture for rescinding the designation. The pack does not have a concept for rescission. The bond is the architecture itself. To undo it would require a different kind of animal, and these are not a different kind of animal. I was not aware of any of this when Rek pressed his nose briefly and precisely against the back of my hand, lifted his head, looked at me with those wide, horizontal pupil amber eyes for a long, unhurried moment, and then looked away as though the relevant data had been gathered and the record updated, and nothing further was required. I sat still. I let him. I wrote in the report, subject made brief voluntary physical contact, non-aggressive, no incident. Durrell completed her scent mapping 6 weeks later. With Durrell, it was brief and businesslike, which is consistent with every other interaction I have had with her in the years since. She pressed her muzzle against my hand, verified what she needed to verify, and moved away. Neth took longer. She held her nose against my hand, and then after a moment, pressed her forehead against my forearm, and held it there while I sat completely still, and did not do anything at all except breathe. In Revith's monograph, this secondary contact is described as proximity affirmation, high confidence variant. In my experience of it, it was something that I did not have a behavioral term for and did not feel I needed one. There is a particular quality to the mutual attention of a Sorvakh and a person that person has been scent mapped by that I want to try to describe to the board, because I think it bears on everything that follows, and because the behavioral literature, despite its precision on the physiological mechanics, does not quite get at the experiential quality of it. It is not like being watched by a predator. I have been watched by predators on frontier postings over 20 years, and the quality of that attention is surveillance, an ongoing assessment of threat level, of the distance between potential prey and potential danger, a calculation being continuously run. The attention of a scent-mapped Sorvakh is not surveillance. It is something I would call accounting. You are in the space. The space is the territory. The accounting of the territory includes you. The accounting is continuous, total, and not directed at determining anything about you specifically, but simply at maintaining an accurate record of where you are, and that you are all right. I have been in crowded rooms where I was in some meaningful sense alone. I have been in empty rooms where the accountability of the space felt complete. The difference is not about the number of beings present. It is about whether anyone is doing the accounting. 14 years ago, in a quarantine hold at Forward Post Tethek, Rek began accounting for me. He has not stopped. I notice when I am outside the space where the accounting applies, a quality of exposure that I have never found language for, but that I register clearly in the body. I notice when I return that it resolves. By month 7, I was entering the hold without the hazard suit. I am aware this was a protocol violation, and I am aware that admitting it here is not in my immediate best interest. But I was asked for the truth, and the truth is that the suit was interfering with the checks in a way that I found increasingly difficult to justify to myself. The suit changed my smell in a way that was measurable in Rek's ridge spine behavior. They rose slightly, not to threat lock, just to a heightened attentiveness, whenever I came in suited, and settled more completely and more quickly when I did not. I raised this with the post commander, who told me I was under no circumstances to enter without full protective equipment. I agreed with him, went back to my quarters, and then continued to enter without the suit for the next 5 months, which I did not document. I am documenting it now, in this deposition, because the board asked for the complete picture. During those 5 months, the 3 animals grew. Sorvakh grow rapidly. It is a feature of their ecology that Revith's monograph addresses at some length and that I had occasion to observe firsthand. Rek, by the time I had been at Tethek for 18 months, was no longer the size of a transport skiff. He was the size of a transport vehicle. His ridge spines at full fan would have cleared the whole doorframe. He moved through the concrete space with the unhurried, absolute quiet of an animal that has never needed to announce itself to anything in its environment and has always known this. He could cross the full length of the hold from end to end without producing a sound I could detect, and the hold was not a small space. He did not use this quality around me. Around me he made noise. Not vocalizations in any strict sense, nothing aggressive, nothing communicative in the way that communication is usually understood. It was a vibration that originated somewhere in his chest and sustained itself as long as I was in the hold, a frequency that I felt more in my sternum than heard with my ears. The way you feel the low notes of large machinery in the bones rather than the air. Durrell and Neth generated different registers of it, a harmony to Rek's bass, and the combination of the 3 produced an effect that I found, and have found every day since, to be the most settling sound I have ever been present for. Revith's monograph calls this the pack's den idle, the resting vocalization that pack members produce for other pack members in the shared territory, signifying that nothing is wrong, that the position is known, that the accounting is complete. It says, "You are here, and we know you are here, and that is correct, and nothing is wrong." I note for the board's record that I have slept better in rooms where that sound is present than in any other sleeping conditions in my adult life. I offer this not as a subjective flourish but as a practical data point. After 20 years in garrison service and the kind of fractured sleep that comes with it, I slept through the night for the first time in years in the month. Rec first began producing the den idol in my presence. I note this because it is relevant to a complete understanding of what the bond has meant, and what its disruption would mean. Commander Teth Salvar replaced the post commander at month 22. She reviewed the Sorvakh files on her first day and called me in. She was thorough and specific and did not raise her voice. She asked me to confirm that I had been entering the hold alone and unsuited for approximately 14 months. I confirmed it. She asked me whether the animals had exhibited any aggressive behavior toward me at any time during those 14 months. I told her they had not. She asked me what I did in the hold. I told her I sat on the floor. She looked at me for a moment. Then she asked whether I would be willing to undergo a formal behavioral assessment of the animals with a wildlife division consultant observing, so that the actual status could be documented accurately. I said I would. The consultant was Ota Revith's daughter. I did not know this until she introduced herself. She was precise and well-prepared, and she had clearly read her mother's work, which put her ahead of the Wildlife Division's processing capacity by at least a decade. She spent 3 days observing, reviewed my full report history, and asked me questions I answered honestly, because Commander Salvar had made clear that accurate documentation was the goal. On the 4th day, she filed her assessment. The relevant finding: 3 adult Sorvakh, Class 6, Pack ID Hesavar Tethek, have completed full territorial scent incorporation of 1 human individual, Garrison Sergeant Cassian Vess. The pack's behavioral architecture designates Vess as a permanent pack member in the territorial recognition category. No mechanism for rescission of this designation exists within documented Sorvakh behavioral norms. Recommend formal recognition of Sergeant Vess as primary pack coordinator for these 3 individuals. Recommend strongly against any attempt to separate, relocate, or reassign the pack independent of Vess's concurrent reassignment. Formal risk assessment on attempted separation. Extreme. Commander Salvar implemented the recommendation. My file was updated. The hold was redesignated a controlled habitat bay. I was formally designated primary pack coordinator for the Hesavar Tethek Sorvakh unit. The paperwork was filed. The matter was settled. The 6 years between the Revith assessment and my retirement were the most straightforward of my garrison career. The converted habitat bay was adequate. The routine worked. Rec had grown to a size that required some renegotiation of how I moved through certain parts of the hold. There were angles from which it was not possible to fully appreciate how large he was, and angles from which it was impossible not to. But the substance of the routines was unchanged. He came to the door when I arrived. He settled near me at the first check. Neth pressed her forehead against my shoulder when she passed. Durrell watched and formed opinions that she communicated through posture and the angle of her head. I was reviewed twice more during those 6 years by Wildlife Division consultants. Both were routine. Both confirmed the Revith finding without significant modification. The second consultant asked me what I thought the animals experienced when I was not present. I said I did not know. He said the behavioral literature suggested that pack-bonded animals in the absence of a recognized pack member could show elevated stress indicators. I said I tried to manage my schedule to minimize extended absences. He wrote something in his notes. I did not ask what he had written. There were also 2 reassignment attempts during those 6 years. In the 4th year, a Wildlife Division processing officer arrived at Tethek with documentation for his consolidated habitat facility in the inner corridor, arguing it was more appropriate for the animal's long-term management. Commander Salvar reviewed the documentation, noted the risk language in the Revith assessment, and filed a formal objection with the Wildlife Division before I had been informed the documentation had arrived. The reassignment was withdrawn. In the 5th year, a different processing officer arrived with similar documentation, citing efficiency consolidation. Commander Salvar filed the same objection within 2 hours of receipt. The documentation was withdrawn within a week. I was informed of both incidents after they had been resolved. Commander Salvar was a thorough and careful officer, and I owe her a debt. The compact's documentation system has no category for. 6 years after that, I retired from the garrison. The question of the Sorvakh had been raised in my final year personnel review, and after extended back and forth between the garrison, the Wildlife Division, and the Compact's Resettlement Bureau, the conclusion reached was practical. Separation risk. Extreme was not a situation anyone wanted to test, and the most manageable path was to attach the 3 animals to my next civilian posting. I had accepted a logistics coordination position at Waystation Sorvakh, a compact resettlement hub in the mid-corridor, which had the staging bay capacity and a quarantine risk convertible to habitat, without significant structural cost. The Wildlife Division approved the transfer. The Sorvakh were on my manifest when I reported to Sorvakh. 3 years at Sorvakh before last month. I do my job, which is resettlement logistics coordination, manifests, capacity planning, communication with incoming transport captains, the continuous low-grade problem solving that the movement of large numbers of people across contested corridors generates in its daily operation. I am good at this work. I am thorough and I keep accurate records, and I do not enjoy complications, which is part of why I have been careful, at every stage of the Sorvakh's history here, to do everything by the book except the specific things I have already disclosed to this board. The Sorvakh have a large converted habitat bay off the main staging area, with a partition door I keep open during operational hours. The staging area crew know them. New crew members are briefed in a conversation I have given enough times to have refined to its essential points. The animals are not dangerous to anyone who does not present as a threat to a pack member. Do not touch the ridge spines without invitation, and you will not be invited. If they approach you, hold stills and let the interaction proceed at their pace, and they will move on. If they do not move on, find me. 3 years, no incidents requiring my intervention. I want that on the record. I should describe what daily operations at Waystation Sorvakh actually look like with the Sorvakh present, because I think the formal documentation may have created a false impression of drama or instability. Resettlement families passing through Sorvakh notice the Sorvakh for the first time when they enter the main staging bay for documentation processing. This follows a predictable sequence I have observed many times. The family enters, one member stops, the others stop. There is a moment of complete stillness. Then, because Rek or Neth or Durl is typically on the far side of the bay near the habitat partition doing nothing in particular, the registered danger is gradually recalibrated as the family watches nothing happen. Rek may be asleep. Neth may be tracing the wall with her muzzle in the pattern she uses to track airflow changes, which she does with consistent thoroughness and which I have never decoded. Durl may be watching the family with her head at the angle that means she has formed an initial assessment and is updating it in real time. By the time the family reaches my documentation stations, the Sorvakh have usually been reclassified in their assessment from immediate threat to large animal that does not appear to be paying attention. Children make this reclassification faster than adults and then proceed through the subsequent categories: large animal, warm-looking animal, animal one might want to touch, in significantly less time. I have redirected 7 unauthorized approach attempts by children over 3 years. In 6 of the 7 cases, the Sorvakh's response to a small human moving toward them in obvious goodwill was to become very still and wait. In 5 of those 6, the child placed a hand gently on the nearest fur, looked back at the accompanying adult with profound satisfaction, and was collected without incident. In the 6th case, a small girl sat down on the floor directly in front of Neth and looked up at her for approximately 4 minutes, during which Neth looked back down at her and neither of them did anything else. The girl's father collected her eventually, apologizing, and Neth watched him do it with an expression that suggested she had not finished gathering data. The 7th involved a 4-year-old who attempted to climb Rek's tail. Rek moved the tail. The 4-year-old sat down. After a moment, she got up and tried again. Rek moved the tail. They did this 3 times. I noted it under routine operations. The board has the operational logs. In those 3 years, I have watched Rek continue to grow in the way that large, long-lived predators grow past their apparent plateau, not rapidly but steadily. An added depth to the chest, an added height at the shoulder, a quality of mass that I noticed differently than I noticed it a year ago. He moves through the staging bays with the authority of something that has inventoried every centimeter of the space and found it satisfactory. At rest, his ridge spines hold the deep, steady amber I have known for all these years, the warm lamplight that has become as much a feature of my daily environment as the sound of the ventilation system or the weight of my own footsteps on the composite floor. When he is pleased, and I have over the years learned to read the specific indicators of this, the spines pulse once slowly, a single slow breath of light. When he is alert, they rise to harder amber and hold. When he is genuinely concerned, they go to gold, a different quality of light, edged and attentive. White, 14 years. Not once. I want that on the record. Neth and Durl, I know differently than I know Rek. In the way you know people who are important to your life. Through a register that is not the first language between you. Neth presses her forehead against the back of my shoulder when she passes me on the floor of the staging bay. A brief, warm pressure that I have received enough times to stop noting consciously and simply receive. Durl watches. She positions herself at a considered distance from whatever is happening and observes it with an expression that I can only call editorial. A slight narrowing of the horizontal pupils. A particular angle of the head that says she has formed a view about the proceedings and is deciding whether sharing it would be productive. I know this expression because I have worn it in staff meetings for most of my professional life. The feeling of recognition, the first time I saw it on Durl's face, was one of the more startling moments of my posting at Tethek. I should describe the incident with Transport Captain Vessin Tor, which is in the files as a separate reviewed matter. In my second year at Sorvakh, Captain Tor arrived on a routine resettlement run and, during the staging bay walkthrough, grabbed Neth's ridge spines. He did this because someone at the dock had mentioned the spines were warm to the touch, and he wanted to verify this personally. This is the sort of thing that the enhanced briefing procedure was specifically designed to prevent, but the briefing had been conducted by a second-shift crew member, who I subsequently learned had summarized it as, "Don't mess with the big animals," which is accurate as far as it goes but does not cover the specific case of a transport captain deciding that a direct personal investigation was in order. Neth vocalized sharply. Rek and Durl were through the partition door before Tor had processed what he had done. He was on the floor. Rek's forepaws were planted on the floor on either side of his chest, not on him. Durl's muzzle was 8 centimeters from his left ear. Neth stood 3 paces back watching the resolution of the situation. The process had taken under 4 seconds. I came through the partition door approximately 20 seconds after the vocalization. I said, "Rek, Durl, easy." They stepped back. Tor stood up, uninjured, and completed the walkthrough without further incident. He was a quieter person than he had been before Neth's vocalization, and that quality of quietness persisted through the departure processing. I tell this story not as an illustration of danger, but as an illustration of precision. 4 seconds from provocation to resolution, no injury. The capacity for a different outcome existed in full. The decision not to exercise it was made deliberately. I have thought about this many times. The Compact's classification of Class 6 wildlife is built on a model of unpredictable danger. My experience over many years is of something I would describe as precisely predictable, within a framework that the standard criteria were not built to accommodate. That framework, within the pack, you are safe. Outside the pack, you are assessed. If the assessment is neutral, you are ignored or moved aside without injury. If the assessment is threat, you are stopped. The scale of the response is proportionate to the scale of the threat. I have never, in 14 years, seen this framework produce an outcome disproportionate to what preceded it. I have never seen these animals make an error in their assessments. I have never seen them apply force that was not in the context of their architecture warranted. I want that on the record before I describe the 14th. Regional Transit Director Harold Sove arrived at Waystation Sorvakh on the 14th for a quarterly operational review. He arrived with 3 staff, a logistics aide, a documentation specialist, and a behavioral science contractor employed by Kethavar Behavioral Systems. I know the board is familiar with Kethavar Behavioral Systems and its position relative to a pending compact-funded predator behavioral study, contract requiring access to Class 6 pack predators in long-term human-bonded status. I will note, without elaborating further, that there are 3 such animals in the compact registry. They are at Waystation Sorvakh, and they are on my manifest. The review began at 0900. It was routine for 2 hours. Sove's questions were precise and specific to Sorvakh operational protocols to a degree that a quarterly reviewer would not typically reach. The questions of someone verifying information he already largely had. At 11:40, he asked to walk the habitat bay with me privately. I did so. At 12:15, we returned to the administrative corridor. He presented me with a revised access authorization matrix. My personal access credentials to the Sorvakh habitat bay were revoked, effective immediately, pending formal behavioral hazard reassessment by qualified contractors. His aide and documentation specialist and the behavioral science contractor were all present. I read the document. I asked him whether the reassessment had been scheduled in coordination with the Wildlife Division, given the formal assessment already on file. He said the details were being handled at the directorial level. I said the Wildlife Division was a relevant department for any change affecting Class 6 registered assets, and that I was asking whether they had been consulted before the credential revocation was issued, for the record. He said the record was his to manage. I said I understood that. I was asking a procedural question because I wanted the answer documented. Director Sove took one step forward, put his right hand flat against my chest and shoved me. Not hard enough to take me off my feet. I am 54 years old and I spent 20 years in garrison service. I have been shoved harder by supply crates, but the gesture was not ambiguous. It was deliberate. It was witnessed by his aide, his documentation specialist, his behavioral science contractor, and himself. I was shoved in the administrative corridor of Waystation Sorvakh by the regional transit director, in front of 4 witnesses. The partition door between the administrative corridor and the staging bay was open. The administrative corridor runs parallel to the staging bay and is separated from it by a partition wall with a broad sliding panel that I keep open during operational hours. The habitat bay is adjacent to the staging bay. The Sorvakh have free access between the habitat bay and the staging area. The open partition makes the corridor and the staging bay effectively one continuous space. I was looking at Sove when he pushed me. I was not looking at the staging bay, but I heard the change in the idle. 14 years of that sound. I know every variation of it. The resting pulse at the end of a quiet day, the slightly elevated register when a new transport docks and produces unfamiliar noise, the brief tightening when something startles, and then the slow descent back to rest. I know the specific quality of the shift from rest to alert the way I know the sound of my own footsteps, not consciously, not by analysis, but in the body, in the part of this nervous system that registers the background conditions of the place you are in, and notes when those conditions change. The moment Sove's hand contacted my chest, the idle changed. Sove turned toward the partition door. His aide turned. The contractor turned. They all turned. Rek came through at a walk. I want to be precise about this for the record. In the 14 years I have known Rek, I have learned to read his gaits, the way you learn to read any particular vocabulary that you encounter enough times over enough years. There is the loose rolling gait of an animal that is going somewhere without urgency, that has no particular agenda and is simply relocating through a space that is familiar and satisfactory. There is the more focused, higher-shouldered gait of an animal that has detected something specific and is moving toward more information. There is the stop and assess, the weight shifting back onto the haunches, the ridge spines coming to full alert amber as the evaluation begins. And there is the one I am describing now, which I have only seen once before, in my 11th year at Tethek, when a resupply contractor arrived with portable assessment equipment that produced a sound frequency the Sorvakh found intensely aversive and which the contractor, despite being instructed not to activate it in the habitat bay, activated in the habitat bay. This gate is level. The weight transfers completely on each step, no bounce, no hurry. The body is low, the head is forward, the ridge spines are white, and the shadows they cast are sharp and cold on whatever surface they fall on. It is the gait of an animal that has arrived at a conclusion and is moving to implement it at the pace the conclusion warrants, which is not a fast pace because fast implies uncertainty about the outcome, and the outcome is not uncertain. He did not charge, he did not run, he walked. The long, absolutely level, weight-transferred gait of an animal that has no reason to hurry, because there is nothing in the environment that can add urgency to a situation that is already decided. His ridge spines, as he cleared the partition doorway, were raised. They were not amber. They were not gold. They were white. The cold, absolute white of a cutting torch at full output, directional light that threw shadows on the floor and walls of the administrative corridor. Neth came through on his left. Durrell came through on his right, both at white. The formation they took, the wide flanking spread that covered the corridor from wall to wall, is not a formation I taught them, and not a formation documented in the behavioral reports from Hesavar or Tethek. It was a formation from something deeper in their architecture than training or conditioning. It was the formation of a species that has been doing exactly this, in exactly these circumstances, for an amount of time that does not have a number I know. Director Sove's party went completely still. Rex stopped 2 meters from Sove. That distance, I have noted it before in assessments that involved external contractors who startled the animals, is his personal assessment range. Close enough that the assessment is unambiguous. Far enough that the assessment can be completed without additional approach. He looked at Sove. Not at me, at Sove, with the full level attention of an animal that has made a decision and is communicating its terms. The sound he produced was not the idle. It was the vocalization that Revith's daughter, when I described it to her later, identified from the behavioral literature as terminal assessment vocalization. The communication of a verdict already rendered, directed at the subject of the verdict. It was below ordinary hearing range for most species. I felt it in my back teeth, in my sternum, in the old fracture in my left wrist from a gate incident 14 years ago. It had no aggression in it, in the way aggression is usually framed. It was colder than aggression. It was the communication of a conclusion. Sove did not move. None of his party moved, I said. Wreck? He did not look at me. He held on Sove, I said, quieter. Easy. His head moved a degree in my direction. A flicker. An acknowledgement that the information had been received and was being held alongside the assessment already in progress. Not a stand down. An acknowledgement. I stepped forward to stand beside him at his shoulder. Not between him and Sove. I have enough self-preservation instinct remaining after all these years to know that placing myself in the sight line of 3 threat-locked Sorvakh is not a sound decision regardless of my relationship with them. I stood beside him. I put my hand on the base of his neck between the first and second ridge spines, in the place I have known for 14 years, the thickest fur, the warmest point, the place where the ridge spine array concentrates its vibration most clearly into the palm of the hand. I said, I've got it. Rek held for a moment, long enough to make several points clearly. Then his ridge spines began to descend. Not to rest, not to amber, but to gold. Raised, hard-edged, attending. Watching Sove with the gold alert quality that I have seen precede a great number of things I am glad did not happen in those specific circumstances, I turned to Director Sove. He was the color of new concrete. His aide was against the corridor wall. The documentation specialist was holding his data slate with both hands. The behavioral science contractor had an expression that I can only describe as professional attentiveness. The focused, recording quality of a person who has just witnessed something that is going directly into a report with considerable care, I said. I'd recommend we pause the review and contact the Wildlife Division before processing any further changes to the access matrix. Sove said nothing for a moment, then. This will be reviewed at the directorial level, I said. Of course, I'm available to cooperate. I'm cooperating with a review right now. More pointed than the moment required, I acknowledge that. The review was adjourned. Sove's party moved to the administrative annex. I remained in the corridor with the Sorvakh until Rek's ridge spines descended from gold to hard, amber, which took approximately 40 minutes. Neth settled against the wall to my left. Durrell faced the annex door and watched it with an editory expression that was among the clearest opinions she has expressed in 3 years of acquaintance. At some point in those 40 minutes, Rek sat down next to me. The board should understand what this means physically. A transport vehicle settling its full weight onto a composite floor. The corridor vibrated once resonantly, and then was still. He turned his head toward me. I turned mine toward him. He lowered his head until his chin rested against my thigh, and he closed his eyes. After a time, his ridge spines descended all the way to flat. The faint, warm, steady amber of a lamp left on in another room. I put my hand on the back of his neck and left it there. We sat there for a while. During those 40 minutes on the corridor floor, I thought about the deposition I was going to have to give. I thought about it practically, in the way I think about most things. What had happened, in what order, who had been present, what the documentation chain would look like. I thought about Director Sove in the annex and what he was composing, and how long the transit authority's review process would take. I thought about whether I had handled the moment of the shove correctly, and concluded that I had not handled it with perfect procedural clarity, but that I had handled it honestly, and that honest handling of procedurally imperfect moments is generally what the record requires. I also thought about the 14 years. I am not a reflective person by disposition. I do not look back on my history with frequency or sentimentality. But 40 minutes on a corridor floor with a very large animal asleep on your leg produces a quality of stillness, in which the record of things presents itself without effort, and I looked at the record. 14 years ago, I sat on the floor of a concrete hold because there was a frightened, juvenile predator in it, and sitting on the floor seemed like the right thing to do. I did not make a decision to build a relationship over 14 years, or to become the primary coordinator for a pack unit that would eventually follow me into civilian life and attend quarterly operational reviews with a certain attentiveness that several directors did not anticipate. I made a decision to sit on the floor once, and then made the same decision the following day, and the day after that, and somewhere in that sequence the situation became what it became. I think the board should understand this because I believe it is relevant to the risk assessment framework. The bond that Director Sove's credential revocation was attempting to manage did not arise from strategy. It arose from the application of a principle I have held in one form or another for my entire working life. That presence is the fundamental resource, that showing up consistently and honestly is the primary thing, and that situations organize themselves around consistency in ways that are more durable than any formal arrangement the Compact's administrative system has yet devised. I want to try to say something to this board that is not formal deposition language, and I will ask for indulgence. When you are inside the Pact's territorial recognition, when the scent mapping is complete and the designation is permanent, and the architecture of the Pact's attention covers the ground you stand on, the world outside that determination stops having a particular quality of danger. Not because the dangers are gone, they are not gone, but the Pact's attention covers the territory, and the territory includes you, and the coverage is complete and continuous, and does not require your participation to maintain. Director Sove was in the annex. The next several weeks of my professional life were going to be complicated. None of that had changed, and I was sitting on the floor of a way station corridor with Rex's head in my lap, and his ridged spines warm under my hand, and I will put this in the record without qualification, completely all right. The Wildlife Division was contacted before end of day through Records Office liaison from Tethek, which had been monitoring the Sorvakh situation through routine operational channels. The division contacted the Transit Authority. The Transit Authority contacted Director Sove's office. The access revocation was suspended pending formal review. The behavioral study contract was not signed. Sove filed a formal complaint citing my insubordination and characterizing the Sorvakh's response as uncontrolled hazard status requiring immediate escalation. The Wildlife Oversight Board reviewed the existing assessment, 14 years of records, 3 years of Sorvakh operational logs, and Sove's complaint, and convened this inquiry board. The complaint describes me as having directed the Sorvakh in an aggressive posture toward the regional transit director. I did not direct them. I spoke to them after they had already taken the posture. The distinction is significant. The complaint also describes the Pact's behavior as an unprovoked threat display. The word unprovoked requires attention. Director Sove placed his hands against my chest and shoved me. The Sorvakh observed this through the open partition. Their response followed. I note that Director Sove has not, in any documentation I have seen, contested that the physical contact occurred. 3 additional observations before I conclude. First, I should have escalated the access revocation through Wildlife Division liaison immediately, rather than pursuing verbal procedural confirmation in the corridor. The verbal approach created a useful record, but the process was not correct. I acknowledge that error. Second, the characterization of the Sorvakh's response as uncontrolled is inaccurate, and I want to say so clearly for the record. They stopped when I said I had it. They stood down to gold when I was beside Rek. That is not uncontrolled behavior. That is controlled behavior, exercised with a precision and a proportionality that no formal protocol would have produced in those circumstances. What Director Sove experienced was 3 animals acting within their nature with complete consistency. Oda Revith's daughter's monograph addresses the distinction between this and uncontrolled behavior on page 11. I would ask the board to read page 11 third. I have been asked in the pre-inquiry preparation whether I believe the Sorvakh would have made physical contact with Director Sove if I had not intervened. I have thought about this carefully. I do not know. What I believe, and I use that word with full awareness of its evidentiary limitations, is that what Rek was communicating was not an imminent attack. It was the communication of a verdict and its terms. What would have followed if the verdict had been ignored? If Sove had moved toward me again, or done anything registering as escalation, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that in 14 years I have not seen these animals make an error in their assessments, and I have not seen them apply force they did not consider warranted, and I have not seen them fail to recognize when a situation was resolved. I will leave the board to draw its own conclusions from that consistent pattern. I want to close with something outside the standard deposition register. I spent 20 years at frontier postings that had resource justification reviews every 3 years. And the reviews always came down to the same question: is this posting worth what it costs? The answer was always, after sufficient deliberation, yes. But it was never a comfortable yes, and it never seemed to understand what the posting was actually doing. I got used to watching that calculation get made. When Rek pressed his nose against the back of my hand for the first time 14 years ago, in a concrete quarantine hold at Forward Post Tethek, I did not understand what it meant. I have now told the board what it meant: the scent mapping, the territorial recognition, the architecture of a species that, once it designates someone as pack, does not possess a mechanism for revising that designation, because the designation is the architecture itself, and the architecture is not administrative. The compact's administrative architecture is built on the premise that designations can be revised, that access can be revoked, that belonging is a status updatable in a matrix and communicated down the chain of authority with appropriate notice and documentation. The Sorvakh were not built with that premise. Ota Revith said so. Her daughter said so in a formal assessment that was implemented, and then, apparently, forgotten by everyone except the people who had to live with it. I am telling the board now, in a deposition I trust will be read. The designation is not administrative. It was made once in a concrete room, when a juvenile predator who was frightened and far from home pressed his nose against a garrison sergeant's hand, because the sergeant had been willing to sit still in the dark without armor, and without a weapon and without a plan, and that one decision has been the same decision every day for 14 years, and there is no directorial-level procedure for revising it. Director Sove is uninjured. The behavioral study contract was not signed. The access revocation has been suspended. I am still the primary coordinator for the Hesavar Tethek Sorvakh unit. This morning, when I came through the habitat bay door at the start of the day shift, Rek's ridge spines glowed the deep, steady, warm amber of a lamp left on in another room. I don't know what more I can tell the board than that. Thank you for your time.